The stillness of winter has always carried whispers of the past. Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten moments reveal their secrets. Today, we journey back to Christmas of 1912, when a photographer captured 7 children. But something about the middle child's toy isn't quite right. The story begins in December of 1912, in the small town of Millbrook, nestled between snow-covered hills and dense forests. The town was preparing for Christmas, with garlands of holly and pine adorning storefronts, and the scent of roasted chestnuts filling the crisp air. Gas lamps cast warm halos on the freshly fallen snow as horse-drawn carriages carried last-minute shoppers through cobblestone streets. The Caldwell family lived in a Victorian mansion at the edge of town, a grand house with a history as rich as its owners. Arthur Caldwell had made his fortune in the railroad industry, while his wife Eleanor came from old money. They had 2 children of their own, 10-year-old Elizabeth and 8-year-old James. This Christmas would be special, as the family was hosting Eleanor's sister Margaret and her 5 children who were traveling from Boston following the recent passing of Margaret's husband. Arthur stood by the window of his study, watching as the carriage approached through the swirling snow. His pocket watch showed 4:15. They had made good time despite the weather. The 5 Blackwood children would be staying with them until after New Year's, a decision Arthur had mixed feelings about. His wife's sister had always been somewhat peculiar, and her children were largely unknown to him. "They're here," Eleanor announced, sweeping into the room in her emerald green dress, pearl necklace catching the light from the chandelier. "Remember, Arthur, these children have just lost their father. We must make this Christmas memorable for them." Arthur nodded, adjusting his bow tie as the sound of horses and carriage wheels crunching on snow grew louder. "Of course, my dear. The house is prepared, and Elizabeth and James are excited to meet their cousins." The first to enter was Margaret Blackwood, a widow at 36, her black mourning clothes a stark contrast to the festive decorations that adorned the entrance hall. Behind her came her children, 12-year-old twins Albert and Theodore, 11-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Josephine, and the youngest, 5-year-old Edward. "Sister," Eleanor embraced Margaret, whose pale face showed the toll of recent grief. "Welcome to our home. Children, please come in from the cold." The Blackwood children filed in, each carrying a small valise. They were remarkably well behaved, standing in a neat row as they were introduced to their uncle and cousins. Arthur noted how different they seemed from his own boisterous offspring. There was a stillness about them that seemed unnatural for children, especially the middle child, Catherine. Catherine stood exactly in the center of her siblings, neither smiling nor frowning. In her arms, she clutched a porcelain doll dressed in Victorian finery. The doll's painted face was turned away, pressed against Catherine's chest in a protective embrace. "Catherine," Margaret said softly, "won't you show your aunt and uncle your special friend?" The girl's grip tightened on the doll, her knuckles whitening. "Matilda doesn't like to be looked at," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the grand fireplace. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Arthur before kneeling to the child's level. "That's quite all right, dear. Perhaps Matilda will feel more comfortable after you've settled in. Elizabeth can show you to your room." As the children were led upstairs by the Caldwell's housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, and the excited Elizabeth, Arthur pulled his wife aside. "How long has Catherine had that doll?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I've never seen it before." Margaret mentioned in her letters that Catherine had become withdrawn after Charles's death, but she said nothing about a doll. Margaret overheard them. "Catherine found Matilda shortly after the funeral," she explained, removing her gloves. "I don't know where she came from. I assumed one of the mourners brought it as a gift, though no one claimed responsibility. I was going to take it away. There's something about it I don't quite like. But Catherine became so distressed that I relented. It's been her constant companion ever since." "Children often find comfort in such things during difficult times," Eleanor said diplomatically, though Arthur noticed the concerned look that passed between the sisters. That evening, dinner was a formal affair, as was customary in the Caldwell household. The children were dressed in their finest clothes, the Blackwood children notably in subdued colors appropriate for a family in mourning. Catherine sat in the middle of the children's section of the table, the doll placed on her lap beneath the tablecloth. "No toys at the dinner table," Mrs. Holloway admonished as she served the soup. "Matilda isn't a toy," Catherine replied, her voice suddenly clear and firm. "She's hungry too." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table until Arthur cleared his throat. "Perhaps Matilda would prefer to wait in your room until after dinner." Catherine's eyes, gray as the winter sky, fixed on her uncle. For a moment, Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Then the girl nodded once and whispered something to the doll before handing it to Mrs. Holloway, who held it at arm's length. "I'll place it, her, on your bed, Miss Catherine," the housekeeper said, quickly leaving the dining room. When Mrs. Holloway returned several minutes later, Arthur noticed she seemed unsettled. Throughout the dinner, she kept glancing toward the staircase, as if expecting to see someone descending. Later that night, after the children had been put to bed, Arthur found Mrs. Holloway in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared a tray of tea. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Holloway?" he asked. "You seemed disturbed at dinner." The housekeeper, normally stoic and unflappable, hesitated before speaking. "It's nothing, sir. Just an old woman's fancies. Please, speak freely." She set down the teapot carefully. "When I placed that doll on Miss Catherine's bed, I could have sworn its head turned to watch me leave the room. And," she lowered her voice, "I've worked in grand houses all my life, Mr. Caldwell. I've seen my share of fine toys and dolls. That one, it's not like any doll I've ever seen. The craftsmanship is remarkable, yes, but there's something in its expression that isn't right." Arthur smiled reassuringly. "Porcelain dolls can be quite lifelike. The Germans and French have made great advances in their manufacture. I'm sure in the right light they can appear to move." "Perhaps you're right, sir," Mrs. Holloway conceded, though she didn't look convinced. "Will you be wanting your nightcap in the study?" "Yes, thank you. And Mrs. Holloway, let's not mention this to Mrs. Caldwell or Mrs. Blackwood. The children have been through enough without ghost stories frightening them further." That night the temperature dropped precipitously. The wind howled around the eaves of the old house, rattling window panes and causing the timbers to creak and groan. Arthur was awakened just after midnight by what he thought was the sound of small footsteps in the hallway outside their bedroom. Careful not to wake Eleanor, he donned his robe and stepped into the corridor, lamp in hand. "Is someone there?" he called softly. The hallway was empty, shadows dancing in the flickering lamplight. Arthur was about to return to bed when he noticed that the door to the attic stairs was ajar. He was certain it had been closed before they retired for the night. Mrs. Holloway was meticulous about such things. Frowning, he approached the door and peered up the narrow staircase. "Hello?" he called again, his voice echoing in the darkness above. A cold draft wafted down, carrying with it the faint scent of mothballs and old paper. Arthur hesitated, then began to climb, the wooden steps creaking beneath his weight. The attic was rarely used except for storage, old furniture, trunks of clothing, and mementos from generations of Caldwells. The lamp's glow revealed nothing unusual at first. Dust-covered shapes beneath sheets, trunks stacked against the walls, rafters disappearing into darkness. Then he saw it, a small figure sitting cross-legged on the floor near the dormer window, back turned to him. "Catherine?" Arthur approached cautiously. "You shouldn't be up here, child. It's dangerous in the dark." The figure didn't move. As Arthur drew closer, his heart began to pound. It wasn't Catherine at all, but her doll, Matilda, propped up against an old trunk. Its porcelain face gleamed in the lamplight, painted lips curved in what could almost be interpreted as a smile. Arthur stared at the doll, trying to make sense of its presence. Had Catherine come up here and left it? But why would she part with the toy she'd been so reluctant to let out of her sight? He reached down to pick it up, then hesitated, an irrational reluctance staying his hand. This was absurd. It was just a doll, an inanimate object. With sudden determination he grasped it, surprised by how warm the porcelain felt against his palm. As he lifted the doll, its head rotated slowly until its painted eyes met his. Arthur nearly dropped it in shock, convinced for an instant that it had moved of its own accord. Then reason reasserted itself. The head was obviously on some kind of swivel mechanism, designed to turn when the doll was handled. "Uncle Arthur?" The voice from the attic stairs made him jump. Catherine stood there in her white nightgown, a small candle in her hand casting strange shadows across her solemn face. "Catherine, you gave me quite a start," Arthur said, his voice unsteady. "What are you doing out of bed at this hour?" "I came to find Matilda," she replied, her eyes fixed on the doll in his hands. "She likes to wander at night." A chill ran down Arthur's spine at the child's choice of words. "Dolls can't wander, Catherine. Someone must have brought her up here." Catherine shook her head slowly. "Matilda goes where she wants to go. She's been looking for something ever since she came to us." Arthur's scientific mind rejected such nonsense, but he found himself reluctant to argue. "Well, here she is now. Let's get you both back to bed. It's far too cold up here." As they descended the stairs, Arthur keeping a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, he couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes were fixed on the back of his neck. The next morning brought fresh snow and preparations for Christmas, which was just 3 days away. Eleanor had arranged for a photographer to come that afternoon to take a family portrait, a Christmas gift for Margaret, and a memento of their holiday together. The children should wear their best, Eleanor instructed as breakfast was being cleared away. Mr. Sullivan is one of Boston's finest photographers. He's traveling all this way as a special favor. I don't think Matilda likes having her picture taken, Catherine said quietly. The doll once again clutched to her chest. Margaret sighed. Catherine, perhaps just this once, Matilda could stay in your room during the photograph. The girl's face clouded, and Arthur feared a scene. But then Catherine nodded. She can watch from the window. She likes to watch. The morning passed quickly with preparations for the photograph and the upcoming Christmas festivities. Arthur found himself in his study with his brother-in-law's personal effects. Papers that needed to be reviewed, accounts that required settling. Charles Blackwood had left his affairs in reasonable order, but there were still matters that needed attention. Among the documents was a small leather-bound journal. Arthur hesitated before opening it, conscious that he might be intruding on personal thoughts not meant for his eyes. But as executor of Charles's will, he had a responsibility to examine all documents. The journal contained mostly business notes and daily observations, written in Charles's precise hand. Arthur was about to set it aside when an entry from October, just weeks before Charles's death, caught his eye. Catherine's behavior continues to concern me. The imaginary friend she calls Matilda seems to exert an unusual influence. M suggests it's a normal response to changes at her age, but there's nothing normal about the things Catherine says Matilda tells her. Must speak with Dr. Werner if it persists. Arthur frowned, noting the different spelling of the name. Had Catherine's imaginary friend somehow transformed into the doll she now carried? And when exactly had this doll appeared? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the study door. It was Theodore, one of the twins, his serious face a miniature version of his late father's. Aunt Eleanor asked me to tell you that Mr. Sullivan has arrived with his equipment, Uncle. We're to gather in the drawing room in half an hour. Thank you, Theodore. I'll be there directly. The boy lingered in the doorway. Uncle Arthur, may I ask you something? Of course. Theodore glanced over his shoulder before continuing in a low voice. It's about Catherine's doll. Have you noticed anything strange about it? Arthur studied his nephew carefully. Strange in what way? Albert and I think it moves when no one is looking, and sometimes at night we hear Catherine talking to it, but it sounds like she's answering too, in a different voice. The boy's cheeks flushed. I know it sounds foolish. Not foolish, Arthur assured him, but perhaps your imagination is being influenced by the unfamiliar surroundings and recent events. Grief can affect us in unusual ways, Theodore. The boy didn't look convinced, but nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. I suppose that could be it. The photography session was an elaborate affair. Mr. Sullivan, a portly man with an impressive mustache, had brought a large camera on a wooden tripod and various accessories for lighting and composition. The drawing room furniture had been rearranged to create a suitable backdrop, with the Christmas tree, adorned with candles, glass ornaments, and strands of popcorn and cranberries, prominently featured. The family should be arranged by height, Mr. Sullivan directed, peering from behind his camera cloth. Adults at the back, children in front, smallest at the center. This placed Catherine exactly in the middle of the front row, with her siblings and cousins arranged around her. Arthur noticed that despite her earlier agreement, Catherine had brought the doll with her, holding it partially hidden in the folds of her dark blue dress. Young lady, Mr. Sullivan addressed Catherine, perhaps you could set your doll aside for the photograph. No, Catherine said simply, her grip tightening. Eleanor stepped forward. Catherine, dear, we discussed this. Matilda wants to be in the picture, the girl insisted, her voice taking on that same unsettling clarity Arthur had noticed at dinner. She says it's important. To avoid a disruption, Eleanor exchanged glances with Margaret, who gave a small nod. Very well, but please hold her so we can see your face clearly, Catherine. The girl adjusted the doll so that it sat on her lap, its porcelain face turned toward the camera. Arthur, standing at the back row with Eleanor and Margaret, felt a distinct unease as he looked down at the tableau of children with the doll at the center. Now, everyone remain very still, Mr. Sullivan instructed, disappearing beneath the black cloth. The exposure will take several seconds. No blinking, no moving. The room fell silent. Outside, snow continued to fall, casting a diffuse pearly light through the tall windows. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional hiss and pop from the fireplace. 1, 2, 3, Mr. Sullivan counted. At that moment, Arthur could have sworn he saw the doll's head turn slightly, its painted eyes seeming to look directly at the camera lens. The magnesium flash powder ignited with a brilliant burst of light, temporarily blinding everyone in the room. When Arthur's vision cleared, he saw Catherine whispering to her doll, a secretive smile on her face that he hadn't seen before. The expression transformed her, making her look older somehow, less like a child and more like... He pushed the thought away. The girl was simply playing with her doll, finding comfort in it during a difficult time. There was nothing sinister about a child's attachment to a toy, no matter how unusual the circumstances. Mr. Sullivan emerged from behind his equipment, rubbing his hands together. Excellent, excellent. A fine composition. I shall develop the plates tonight and have prints ready for you by Christmas Eve, as promised, Mrs. Caldwell. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, Eleanor replied, already directing the servants to return the furniture to its proper place. We're most grateful you could make the journey. As the photographer packed his equipment, Arthur noticed him pause as he passed Catherine, who was still seated, conversing quietly with her doll. Mr. Sullivan's jovial expression faltered, and he quickly looked away, his movements becoming hurried and less precise. That evening, Arthur found himself unable to concentrate on his usual after-dinner reading. The journal entry about Catherine's imaginary friend troubled him, as did Theodore's observations and his own experience in the attic. He decided to speak with Margaret directly. He found his sister-in-law in the conservatory, a glass of sherry in hand, gazing out at the snow-covered garden illuminated by moonlight. "Margaret, may I join you?" She turned, offering a wan smile. "Of course, Arthur. It's your house, after all." He sat across from her, choosing his words carefully. "I was reviewing Charles's papers today and came across something that concerned me. He mentioned Catherine had an imaginary friend called Matilda, spelled with an H, before his passing. I couldn't help but notice the similarity to the name of her doll." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. "Yes, Catherine began speaking of this Matilda several months ago." Charles was concerned, especially as some of the things Catherine attributed to this friend were disturbing. Disturbing in what way? Knowledge she shouldn't have. Details about family matters we'd never discussed in her presence. Predictions that came true in unsettling ways. Margaret paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. The week before Charles died, Catherine told him that Matilda said he would be going away forever very soon. We thought nothing of it then. Children say all manner of things. But after the carriage accident and the doll, when exactly did it appear? The day of the funeral. Catherine vanished for almost an hour during the reception at our house. We were frantic, searching everywhere. Then she simply walked into the parlor with that doll in her arms, as if she'd had it all along. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. None of the mourners had brought it, Arthur. I asked everyone. No one knew where it came from. Arthur felt a chill despite the warmth of the conservatory. Have you noticed anything unusual about the doll itself? Margaret was silent for so long that Arthur thought she might not answer. Finally she spoke, her voice strained. Sometimes, when I look at it quickly, I think I see a resemblance. A resemblance. To whom? To my grandmother, Matilda Blackwood. Margaret's eyes met his, fear evident in them. She died when Catherine was an infant. There are no photographs of her in our house. No way Catherine could know what she looked like. But the doll, something in its expression, the shape of its face, it reminds me of her. That's surely a coincidence, Arthur said, though without much conviction. My grandmother was not a kind woman, Arthur. There were rumors about her, especially after my grandfather's mysterious death. Some said she practiced certain arts that no God-fearing person would touch. Arthur was not a superstitious man. He believed in science, in rational explanation, in the tangible world of cause and effect. Yet he could not dismiss the mounting evidence that something unusual was occurring. Margaret, with your permission, I'd like to examine the doll more closely. Perhaps there's a maker's mark or some indication of its origin that could explain... A crash from upstairs interrupted him. Both adults were on their feet instantly, rushing toward the sound, which had come from the children's wing. They found Mrs. Holloway outside Catherine's room, a fallen tray at her feet, tea seeping into the carpet. The housekeeper's face was ashen. "Mrs. Holloway, what happened?" Eleanor appeared from her own room, hastily tying her dressing gown. "The doll," Mrs. Holloway whispered. pointing a trembling finger toward the partially open door. "I was bringing Miss Catherine her chamomile tea for her cough, and I saw... Arthur gently moved the housekeeper aside and pushed the door wider. Catherine's bed was empty, the covers turned back neatly. The doll sat in a small chair by the window, moonlight silvering its porcelain features. As Arthur watched, a cloud passed over the moon, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When light returned, the doll was facing the door, its painted eyes seeming to stare directly at him. "It moved," Mrs. Holloway insisted. "No one touched it, but it turned its head to look at me." Margaret pushed past Arthur into the room. "Where's Catherine?" she demanded, her voice tight with fear. They found the girl in the adjoining bathroom, filling a small porcelain basin with water. She looked up at their entrance, her expression eerily calm. "Matilda was thirsty," she explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She gets thirsty at night." Margaret gripped her daughter's shoulders. "Catherine, this has gone far enough. That thing is just a doll. It doesn't drink, it doesn't speak, and it doesn't move on its own." For the first time since their arrival, Catherine's composure broke. Her face contorted in anger, then fear. "You're wrong. Matilda is real. She's been with our family for generations, and she's chosen me now. If you take her away, she'll be very angry." Arthur stepped forward. "Catherine, where did you get the doll? Please tell us the truth." The girl's eyes darted between the adults, then toward the bedroom where the doll waited. "She found me," Catherine whispered, "in the old cemetery behind the church, after Father's funeral. I was sitting by the Blackwood mausoleum, and she was just there on one of the graves. She told me her name was Matilda, and that she'd been waiting for me." Arthur and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. Eleanor moved to comfort the increasingly agitated child, but Catherine pulled away. "I have to bring her water," the girl insisted. "She's waiting." "Catherine," Arthur said firmly, "I think it would be best if I kept the doll in my study tonight. Just overnight," he added as her expression darkened. "To examine it more closely. You can have it back tomorrow." "No!" Catherine's scream was so sudden and so piercing that everyone flinched. "You can't take her. She belongs with me." Before anyone could react, the girl darted past them into the bedroom, snatched the doll from the chair, and backed into a corner, clutching it protectively. "Catherine, please," Margaret pleaded. "Give the doll to your uncle, just for tonight." "Matilda says no," Catherine replied, her voice once again unnaturally adult and clear. "Matilda says she needs to stay with me until Christmas. There's something she has to do." The standoff might have continued indefinitely had Mrs. Holloway not intervened with unexpected practicality. "Perhaps, Mr. Caldwell, you could examine the doll here, in Miss Catherine's room. That way, she needn't be separated from it." The suggestion, so simple and reasonable, broke the tension. Catherine considered it, then nodded slowly. "Matilda says that would be acceptable." And so, in the strange tableau of that December night, Arthur found himself seated at Catherine's small writing desk, the notorious doll before him, while his wife, sister-in-law, and housekeeper looked on. Catherine sat on her bed, watching his every move with intense concentration. The doll was indeed remarkable craftsmanship. The porcelain was fine, the painting delicate and lifelike. The eyes were glass, a deep brown with an almost amber undertone, set beneath perfectly arched brows. The lips were painted a subtle rose, curved in what could be interpreted as either a slight smile or a contemplative expression. The clothes were exquisitely made, a burgundy velvet dress with lace collar and cuffs, tiny leather boots, even miniature undergarments visible at the hem. Arthur turned the doll gently, looking for any manufacturer's mark or inscription. He found nothing on the visible porcelain parts, nor on the cloth body beneath the fine clothes. "May I?" he asked Catherine, indicating he wanted to remove the doll's dress to check the torso for markings. The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Matilda says you may, but be careful with her clothes." Arthur carefully removed the tiny garments, revealing a cloth body stitched with extraordinary precision. Again, no marks or labels. He was about to concede defeat when he noticed something unusual about the stitching on the back, a subtle variation that suggested an opening. "There appears to be a seam here," he murmured, gently probing the area, as if something might be inside. "Arthur, perhaps this examination could wait until morning," Eleanor suggested, noting Catherine's increasing distress. But Arthur had already located the hidden opening, a clever concealment that would be invisible to casual inspection. Carefully he inserted 2 fingers and felt something within, a small, hard object. He He extracted it carefully. It was a locket, small and oval, made of tarnished silver. Arthur held it up to the lamplight, aware that everyone in the room had gone very still, even Catherine. "Open it," Margaret whispered. With careful fingers, Arthur found the tiny clasp and eased the locket open. Inside was a miniature portrait, faded but still discernible. A stern-faced woman with dark hair pulled severely back, her high collar and brooch suggesting the fashion of the late 1800s. Margaret gasped. "That's her. That's my grandmother Matilda." Catherine slid from the bed and approached, her eyes fixed on the locket. "Matilda says that's what she looked like before, when she lived in this world." A heavy silence fell over the room. Arthur's rational mind scrambled for logical explanations, but none seemed adequate to explain the doll's appearance at the cemetery, the hidden locket with the portrait of a woman Catherine had never seen, and the disturbing instances of apparent movement. "I think," he said finally, "we should all try to get some rest. In the morning we can—" "It's almost Christmas," Catherine interrupted, her voice once again that unsettling adult clarity. "Matilda says everything will be clear on Christmas. That's when she can finally rest." The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere of forced normality and underlying tension. Outwardly, the household continued its Christmas preparations, baking, decorating, wrapping gifts. But Arthur noticed that everyone gave Catherine and her doll a wide berth. The other children avoided playing with their cousin, and even Mrs. Holloway found reasons not to be alone with the girl. Arthur himself spent hours in his study, researching the Blackwood family history through documents Charles had brought with him and books in Arthur's own library. He learned that Matilda Blackwood had indeed died under mysterious circumstances in 1889, just 3 months after her husband's equally unexplained death. There were vague references to her interest in spiritualism and the occult, not unusual for ladies of her era, but apparently Matilda's interests had gone beyond the fashionable parlor seances of the time. More disturbing was what he found about the Blackwood children who had died during Matilda's lifetime. 3 young cousins who had been visiting during the Christmas of 1887. Their deaths had been attributed to a fever, but Arthur found a newspaper clipping that hinted at something more sinister, with veiled references to unnatural practices and disturbing circumstances the authorities declined to investigate fully. On Christmas Eve, Mr. Sullivan arrived with the finished photographs as promised. Arthur met him in the foyer, noting the photographer's haggard appearance. "Mr. Sullivan, you look unwell. Was your journey difficult?" The photographer handed over a flat package wrapped in brown paper. "The journey was fine, Mr. Caldwell. I didn't sleep well last night." "I'm sorry to hear that." Mr. Sullivan glanced around the foyer, then leaned closer. "Mr. Caldwell, I feel I should tell you. There's something unusual about one of the photographs. I've been a photographer for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Arthur felt a now familiar chill. "Unusual in what way?" "The doll, Mr." Sullivan's voice dropped to a whisper. "In the final print it appears different from how I remember it, and I could swear that during the development process, the image changed. The doll's expression, its position, it's subtle, but—" The photographer shook his head. "Forgive me. I'm not explaining myself well. Perhaps it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes, but I felt I should mention it." Arthur thanked him, provided payment, and saw him out, the wrapped package heavy in his hands. He retreated to his study and carefully unwrapped the photographs. There were several prints of various sizes, each showing the Caldwell and Blackwood families arranged before the Christmas tree. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The adults stood in the back row, solemn and dignified. The children were arranged in front, from the tallest, Albert and Theodore, to the smallest, Edward, with Catherine in the center, exactly as Mr. Sullivan had positioned them. Arthur studied Catherine's image more closely. She was staring directly at the camera, a slight smile on her lips. The first genuine smile he had seen from her. The doll sat on her lap, its painted face also turned toward the camera. It took Arthur several moments to realize what was wrong. In the photograph, the doll's expression was not the neutral, slightly smiling countenance he remembered. Instead, its painted features were arranged in what could only be described as a look of triumph, the smile wider, the eyes somehow more alive. And it was holding something that had not been there during the photography session, a small silver locket, identical to the one Arthur had found hidden inside it. Arthur quickly shuffled through the other prints. Each showed the same impossible detail, the doll with its changed expression, and the previously hidden locket now prominently displayed in its porcelain hand. His hands trembling slightly, Arthur locked the photographs in his desk drawer. He needed to speak with Margaret immediately, but as he rose to find her, a commotion from the main hall caught his attention. He found his wife supervising the arrival of the last Christmas deliveries, parcels from distant relatives, a magnificent turkey for tomorrow's dinner, boxes of oranges and nuts for the children's stockings. "Arthur, there you are," Eleanor said, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of the holiday. "Mr. Sullivan delivered the photographs." "Yes, I have them in my study. Eleanor, have you seen Margaret? I need to speak with her urgently." Eleanor's expression sobered at his tone. "She took the children to church for the Christmas Eve service. I stayed behind to oversee the deliveries." "Arthur, what's wrong? You're as pale as a ghost." Before he could answer, Mrs. Holloway approached, a telegram in hand. "This just arrived for you, sir. The boy said it was urgent." Arthur tore open the telegram, his sense of foreboding growing. The message was brief. "Researched Blackwood history stop Mathilda accused of sacrificing 3 children. Christmas 1887. Stop never proven but strong evidence. Stop reportedly seeking immortality through ritual requiring 7 innocent souls. Stop urgent you respond. Stop Professor Wilson Miskatonic University." Arthur stared at the telegram, pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. The doll appearing at the cemetery. The hidden locket. Catherine's insistence that Matilda needed to stay until Christmas. And now, 7 children under one roof. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "When did Margaret say they would return from church?" "Not until after the midnight service. Around 1 o'clock, I expect." She studied his face with growing concern. "Arthur, you're frightening me. What is happening?" He handed her the telegram, watching as she read it, her expression changing from confusion to horror. "But surely you don't think—" "It's just a doll, Arthur. I don't know what it is," he replied grimly. "But I'm not willing to take chances with the children's safety. Where is the doll now?" "Catherine took it with her to church. She takes it everywhere." Arthur checked his pocket watch. 11:30. The midnight service would be starting soon. If he hurried, he might reach the church before anything happened. "I'm going after them," he said, already moving toward the coat rack. "Send Thomas to fetch Dr. Jensen and Constable Perkins. Tell them to meet me at St. Michael's Church. And Eleanor, pray." The snow had stopped, but the night was bitterly cold, the moon occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds. Arthur's carriage raced through the deserted streets of Millbrook, the horse's breath clouding in the frigid air. His mind worked furiously, trying to make sense of what he had learned. If Matilda Blackwood had indeed attempted some dark ritual in 1887, sacrificing 3 children but failing to achieve her goal of immortality, could her spirit somehow have attached itself to the doll? Was she now, through Catherine, attempting to complete the ritual with 7 children instead of 3? It seemed insane, the stuff of penny dreadfuls and ghost stories. Yet Arthur could not dismiss what he had seen with his own eyes. The doll's apparent movement, the hidden locket, the changed expression in the photograph. St. Michael's Church came into view, its Gothic spire reaching toward the night sky. Light glowed from its stained glass windows, and Arthur could hear the faint sound of hymns as he approached. The midnight service was underway. He entered as quietly as possible, slipping into the back pew. The church was filled with Millbrook's residents, all in their Christmas finery. By the soft light of hundreds of candles, he scanned the congregation until he spotted Margaret and the children several rows ahead, their heads bowed in prayer. Catherine sat between her brothers, the doll clutched in her arms. As Arthur watched, the girl's head turned slightly, and she whispered something to the doll. Then, to his horror, the doll's head seemed to rotate of its own accord, until its painted eyes were fixed on him. The minister's voice echoed through the church, and the angel said unto them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people." Catherine stood abruptly, still holding the doll. Margaret tried to pull her back down, but the girl shook off her mother's hand and stepped into the aisle. No one else seemed to notice. All eyes were on the minister as he recounted the nativity story. Arthur moved quickly, making his way along the side of the church as Catherine walked purposefully toward a small door near the altar, the entrance to the church crypt. Her siblings and cousins rose one by one and followed her, as if in a trance. "Catherine!" Arthur called out, no longer caring about disrupting the service. Heads turned. The minister faltered in his reading. Margaret stood, her face a mask of confusion as she saw all 7 children moving toward the crypt door. "Stop them!" Arthur shouted, breaking into a run. But he was too late. Catherine had reached the door and somehow opened it, a door that Arthur knew was kept locked at all times. The girl disappeared into the darkness beyond, followed by the other 6 children. Arthur reached the door just as it swung shut. He grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, he was vaguely aware of the congregation in uproar, of Margaret's screams, of the minister calling for calm. "Stand back," a voice commanded. It was Constable Perkins, who must have been attending the service. The burly lawman threw his shoulder against the door once, twice, 3 times, before it finally gave way with a splintering crash. Arthur and the constable plunged into the darkness beyond, the cold air of the crypt enveloping them. Arthur's lamp revealed stone steps leading down, ancient and worn. "What in God's name is happening, Caldwell?" Perkins demanded as they descended. "The children are in danger," Arthur replied grimly. "All of them." The crypt was a maze of narrow passages between burial vaults, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and decay. Arthur and the constable moved as quickly as they dared, following the sound of children's voices echoing eerily through the underground chambers. They found them in the oldest part of the crypt, a circular chamber beneath the church's main altar. The 7 children stood in a perfect circle, facing inward. Catherine was in the center, the doll held out before her like an offering. She was speaking, but the voice that emerged from her lips was not that of a child. It was the voice of an adult woman, rich and commanding. "The 7th night, the 7th child, the 7th hour," the voice intoned. "Blood of my blood, bound in innocence, bound in sacrifice. The circle completes, and I shall walk again in flesh, not merely spirit bound to porcelain and cloth." The doll in Catherine's hands began to glow with an unnatural light, illuminating the chamber in a sickly green radiance. Arthur could see now that the other children's eyes were closed, their faces slack, as if they were sleepwalking. "Catherine!" he called, stepping forward. "Children, wake up!" The girl's head turned toward him, but it was not Catherine who looked out from those eyes. The face was the same, but the expression belonged to someone else. Someone adult, malevolent, triumphant. "You're too late, Arthur Caldwell," the voice said. "The ritual has begun. By the stroke of midnight, their souls will be mine, and I shall live again." "Mathilda Blackwood," Arthur said, understanding fully at last. "You would sacrifice your own great-grandchildren for your vanity?" The thing that was not Catherine smiled. "They are merely vessels, as this doll has been my vessel these many years, waiting for the right conjunction of time and blood. 7 children of Blackwood blood gathered at Christmas, just as I planned." "But my children," Arthur protested. "Elizabeth and James are not of your bloodline." "Fool," the voice hissed. "Your wife Eleanor is my granddaughter as well, though she never knew it. Your precious children carry my blood as surely as Margaret's brood." From the church above, the bells began to toll midnight. With each sonorous chime, the glow around the doll intensified. Arthur saw, to his horror, that wisps of what looked like luminous mist were beginning to emerge from the children's slightly parted lips, their very souls being drawn toward the doll at the center. Arthur lunged forward, but an invisible force repelled him, sending him sprawling onto the cold stone floor. "The circle cannot be broken from without," Matilda's voice gloated. "Only from within, by one who shares my blood but rejects my gift." Constable Perkins had drawn his revolver. "Stand aside, Mr. Caldwell," he commanded, aiming at the doll. "No!" Arthur cried. "You might hit Catherine." But the constable had already fired. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space of the crypt. The bullet struck the doll squarely, shattering its porcelain head into dozens of pieces. There was a moment of absolute silence, then a scream, not from Catherine, but from the fragments of the doll, a scream of such rage and frustration that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The green light flared blindingly bright, then winked out, plunging the crypt into darkness. When Arthur managed to relight his lamp, he found the children standing exactly where they had been, but now awake and confused, looking around in bewilderment. Catherine alone had collapsed to the floor, the broken doll still clutched in her hands. Arthur rushed to her side, fearing the worst, but the girl's eyes fluttered open as he reached her. They were her own eyes again, a child's eyes, filled with tears and fear. "Uncle Arthur?" she whispered. "What happened? Where are we?" "You're safe now," he assured her, gathering her into his arms. "Everyone is safe. As he carried Catherine up the stairs, the other children following, led by a shaken but resolute Constable Perkins, Arthur glanced back at the fragments of the doll scattered across the crypt floor. For an instant, he thought he saw a wisp of greenish mist rising from the broken porcelain, but it dissipated almost immediately. Margaret was waiting at the top of the stairs, her face white with terror. "The children? Catherine? They're all fine," Arthur assured her, transferring the still dazed Catherine to her mother's arms. "It's over." The church had emptied, the midnight service abandoned in the chaos. Only Eleanor remained, rushing forward to embrace Elizabeth and James. "Arthur, what happened down there?" she demanded. "The constable said something about a doll?" Arthur looked at the 7 children, now safely returned to their parents. They seemed unharmed, though Catherine would likely need time to recover from having been Matilda's primary vessel. "It's a long story," he said wearily, "one perhaps best discussed after the children are safely home and in bed." Later that night, after the children had been settled and the broken doll sealed in a lead box, at Arthur's insistence, the adults gathered in his study. Arthur explained what had happened as best he could, showing them the telegram from Professor Wilson and the photographs with their impossible details. "So the spirit of our grandmother was living in that doll?" Margaret asked, her voice unsteady. "And she intended to sacrifice the children to gain immortality?" "That appears to have been her plan," Arthur confirmed. "She needed 7 children of her own bloodline, gathered at Christmas, the same ritual she attempted in 1887 with only 3 victims. But why Catherine? Why did she choose her as the vessel?" Arthur considered this. Perhaps because Catherine was vulnerable after Charles's death, or perhaps she had some inherent sensitivity that made her receptive to spiritual influence. We may never know for certain. Eleanor, who had been silent throughout his explanation, finally spoke. "And you say I am related to this woman? That my mother was her daughter?" "According to what the entity said, yes. Though we would need to research your family history to confirm it. My mother never spoke of her parents," Eleanor said softly. "She was raised by an aunt in Philadelphia. I always assumed her parents had died when she was young. Or perhaps she was deliberately separated from Matilda after the events of 1887, Arthur suggested, to protect her." The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, startling them all. 1 o'clock. Christmas Day had officially begun. "What shall we do with it?" Margaret asked, nodding toward the lead box on Arthur's desk. "Professor Wilson has offered to take charge of it. He has experience with such matters, apparently. I've arranged for it to be transported to Miskatonic University after the holidays." "And the children? Will they remember what happened?" Arthur shook his head. "I don't think so. They seemed confused but unharmed. Catherine may retain some memories, but with time, even those may fade. We should still celebrate Christmas," Eleanor said unexpectedly. "For the children's sake. They've been through enough without losing their holiday as well." Arthur smiled at his wife, admiring her practical resilience. "You're right, of course. We'll have Christmas as planned. But perhaps," he added, glancing at the lead box, "with fewer dolls than originally intended." Christmas Day dawned clear and bright. The world outside transformed into a glistening white wonderland. The children awoke to stockings filled with treats and a magnificent tree surrounded by presents. If they remembered anything of the previous night's events, they gave no sign of it. Only Catherine seemed subdued, staying close to her mother and showing little interest in her gifts. It wasn't until Arthur presented her with a small package that her eyes lit up with something like her old spirit. "What is it, Uncle?" she asked as she carefully unwrapped it. "Something to replace what was lost," he said gently. Inside the box was a simple rag doll with a smiling, embroidered face. Nothing like the elegant, sinister porcelain creation that had been Matilda's vessel. Catherine studied it for a long moment, then hugged it to her chest. "I shall call her Hope," she declared. Arthur exchanged glances with Margaret, who wiped away a tear of relief. "An excellent name," he agreed. As the day progressed, filled with feasting, games, and music, the events of the previous night receded like a bad dream. The lead box was locked away in Arthur's safe, awaiting Professor Wilson's arrival after the new year. The broken pieces of Matilda's vessel would be studied, perhaps even destroyed, ensuring she could never again threaten the living. When evening came, Arthur found himself alone in his study, nursing a glass of brandy and watching the snow begin to fall once more outside his window. The photograph from Mr. Sullivan lay before him, the final evidence of their brush with the supernatural. In the image, the 7 children smiled innocently at the camera, Catherine at the center. But where the sinister doll had been, there was now only an empty space, as if it had never existed at all. Arthur carefully placed the photograph in the fire, watching as the paper curled and blackened, erasing the last visual record of Matilda Blackwood's failed attempt to cheat death. Some things, he reflected, were best forgotten, consigned to the ashes of history. Outside, the church bells rang, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Arthur raised his glass in a silent toast, to family, to safety, and to the simple joys of Christmas that had very nearly been lost forever. But as he turned away from the window, he didn't notice the small porcelain finger that had somehow escaped the lead box, now lying beneath his desk, nor did he see the faint green mist that rose from it, curling and twisting in the firelight, seeking a new vessel for a spirit that refused to rest. For some stories never truly end, and some souls are too determined to be denied. In the quiet corners of the Caldwell house, as Christmas night deepened and the occupants slept peacefully, something ancient and patient began to stir once more, waiting for the right moment, the right vessel, the right child to continue what had been interrupted. But that is a tale for another time, another Christmas, another photograph with 7 smiling faces and something not quite right about the middle child's toy. The stillness of winter has always carried whispers of the past, some louder than others, some never truly silenced. Look closer, always look closer. Shadow Frames will return with more forgotten moments that reveal their secrets. Until then, sleep well, and perhaps check your family photographs one more time.